Hi, welcome back to the channel. Our today's topic is agents of cross-pollination. As we have learned cross and self-pollination in the previous lecture, so today the topic being agents of cross-pollination. The two common agents are wind and insects. Now, some flowers also pollinated by certain animals and birds, but some flowers are also pollinated by animals or birds like squirrels, bats, etc., or even by water in the case of aquatic plants. Now, insect pollinated means कि जो cross pollination है that occurs with the help of an insect, therefore insect pollinated, and that is known as called entomophilous, which means entomos means insect and phile means affinity. Now, flower usually have the following characteristics. The flower which needs an insect to get pollinated its anthers, that flower should be large enough and should be brightly colored so that it can attract the insects. It must emit scent for attracting insects. Nectar should also be produced by that particular plant. Now, the pollen grains are sticky or spiny. They should be sticky so that they can be stick to the insect's leg and they can be easily carried from one plant to the other. Now, the stigma is sticky and does not generally hang out of the flower. So the stigma is sticky in the case where the pollination is to occur with the help of an insect. The flower tend to be in clusters to make them conspicuous, especially in case where individual flowers are small, example dahlia. Now see, the flowers which are very small in size, they usually form a cluster so that they may be visible to the insect. Now, so these were the characteristics of the insect pollinated. Next is the wind pollinated, which is known as anemophilous. Anemo stands for wind and phile means affinity. Now, the flower usually possess the following features. Now, the wind pollinated must have the following features. The plant, that is, the flowers are small. Flowers need not to be showy or large or brightly colored because they don't need insects to be carry the anthers. Just they need is the wind, so they may be small, not brightly colored, and often dull green. They do not produce scent or nectar because its function is to attract the insects, but in this case only wind is required. So because the plant is wind pollinated, therefore it does not produce any nectar. The stamens long and hang out of the flower to be exposed to the wind. Now the stamens, they are large enough and they hang out of the flower so that they are fully exposed to the wind. Example, in case of maize, you can. The anthers are large and loosely attached to the filaments so that slightest wind may move them. So they are also known as versatile anthers, which means that the anthers, they are loosely attached to the filaments, and if any slight wind comes, then they may get exposed to that anther and the pollen grains may burst out. Now, the pollen is produced in very large quantities because in cross-pollination, as we have studied earlier, that no pollens are much wastage of pollen grains occur. So the pollens have to be produced in large quantity because the fertilization is very uncertain in case of cross-pollination. Pollen grains are light, dry and smooth. They are dry and smooth and light because they have to be carried away by the wind. So wind can carry only the dry and the light particles more far as compared to the heavy particles. So the pollen grains have to be dry and light in weight. The stigma are feathery and hang out of the flower to trap the pollen grains. Now, in case of the gynoecium, what happens that the stigma of that particular flower, that is feathery, so that it can catch or trap the pollen grains which are coming from another plant. So the stigma has to be feathery and it should be hanged out of the flower so that it can trap the coming pollen grains. Now, next is our water pollinated, which means hydrophilous. As you can, it's very certain that hydro means for water and phile means for affinity. Now, flowers are found only in aquatic plants. They have the following characteristics. So the water pollinated, they have following characteristics which are quite different. So the first is pollen grains are produced in large numbers, as we have learned. Now, second point is in some plants the pollen grains have a specific gravity almost equal to that of water. So the pollen grains gravity is almost equal to that of the water, so that they remain floating below the surface of the water. It's almost equal, so that the pollen grains, they remain floating below the surface of the water. Now, in some special cases, male flowers are such that they float on the surface of the water till they meet female flower. Example, in Vallisneria, we can see that the male flowers, they float on the surface of the water till they meet the female flower. Now see, so as you can see in this particular diagram, that is, this is the Vallisneria showing male and female plants. Now this is the male plant of the Vallisneria and this is the female plant. So this is being the male flower and it is the developing fruit here, and these are the female flowers. Now see, the pollen grains, they float on the surface of the water till when they meet the female flower, so that the fertilization could occur. Now, some flowers are pollinated by birds also, and in that case it is known as ornithophily. This is very important, that the pollination by birds is also known as ornithophily. Example in Bignonia and Henna. So you can see in these cases the flowers, they are pollinated by birds. So next is the elephophily, which means it is, the name suggests that elephophily means the pollination which occurs by elephants. Now it is found in the Rafflesia. It is a flower. So the Rafflesia, it is pollinated by elephants, whose flowers are very large and are found at ground level. The pollen grains of one flower get stuck to the feet of the elephant and they may be carried to the stigma of the another flower, where the flower get trampled by its feet. So it's very certain, as it's very common, and you can see that Rafflesia is a very large flower and it is mainly carried by elephants. So it is known as elephophily. Now, next is artificial pollination. Artificial pollination, as the name suggests, that man himself transfers the pollen to the stigma. So where the pollen grains are transferred to the stigma by its own, means by a man, that is known as artificial pollination. In the ancient civilization of Babylonia, it was commonly practiced to sprinkle male flowers of palms on the female. Of course, at that time, they neither knew the sexuality of palm flowers nor anything about pollination. So they simply, what they do, they sprinkle the male flowers on the female ones. Now, artificial pollination is also known as artificial crossing, because it's a crossing only. So it is a standard practice adopted by the plant breeders and scientists. Why they do so? To evolve the new varieties, so that new varieties may come out. Now what they do is they remove the anther of the young flower, which is known as emasculation. It is very important, emasculation and tagging. These processes are very common and they usually come in 1 mark question. So what they do is they remove the anthers that in the young flower, which is known as emasculation, and they cover these flowers with plastic bags, which is known as bagging. So what happens later on, that they pollinate such flowers with the pollen from the plant of the desired varieties. As I've studied this earlier also, that the plant breeder who wants the desired characters in a particular plant, he introduces that particular type of pollen grains. So this is known as artificial pollination. So there are some other examples of pollination also in insect pollinated pea, sweet pea. So what happens in sweet pea case, the insects such as bee, it is very important. So bee alight on the conspicuous corolla. The bee thrusts its long tongue in search of nectar. So what happens is, as you can see in this particular case, this is what a sweet pea diagram. So this is an example of insect pollinated sweet pea, in which the insect is the bee. And what happens, that the bee in search of nectar comes to the flower of the sweet pea. So in this struggle, what happens, first of all, I would like to make you clear about the flower. Now see, this is the whole flower of the sweet pea. Now it consists of standard petals, okay, as you can see. Then wing petals come, and then the keel petal comes, and these are your sepals. So there are 3 types of petals: standard petals, wing petals, and keel petals. Now what happens when the bee rests on the flower of the sweet pea? Now then the wing petals, they are depressed, means वो दब जाती हैं, they are depressed. Now what happens along with wing petals, keel petals, they are also forced down. Okay, so they are forced down, and the stamens and the stigma touch the underside of the body of the insect. So in this case, what happens that the wing petal and the keel petal, they are depressed or they are forced down, and in that particular case, the bee, that the stigma and the style, or what happens that you can just remember in the particular way that the stamens and the stigma, okay, so the stamens and the stigma, they touch the body or the underlying body of the bee, that is an insect. And in case that insect has visited another flower of sweet pea, so in that case it must have the pollen grains sticking on its body or on its leg. So what happens then, the pollen is then transferred to the stigma of this new flower, means this is the new flower for him because he has visited the previous one. So this is the new flower for that particular bee. So the pollen grains which are carried on the bee's legs or on its body, so they are transferred to the stigma of this new flower and thus affects pollination, and in this way pollination may occur. So you can see this is what your sepals, there are free stamens, and what is this? This is a staminal tube which combines, okay, so forming the staminal tube, and these are the free stamens. This is the stigma, style and ovaries there. So when the bee comes, the wing petals and the keel petals, they are depressed downwards, and in that particular case, the stigma and the stamens, they touch the body, underlying body, means जो नीचे वाली part है bee का, they touch that, and you know in that particular case वो pollen grains उठा लेता है, means कि उसकी body में जो है वो pollen grains attach हो जाते हैं. So and in case it has visited a previous flower, so this is the new flower for him, so he may shed the pollen grains on this new flower and thus affecting pollination. So if it does not lead to cross pollination, so it may also lead to self pollination in this case. So as you can see, this is the pollen grain and this is what your ovary, stigma and style. So this is the carpel and these are the floral parts of the sweet pea. And here is an important thing to remember, that the stamens and the carpel, they are enclosed within the keel petal and therefore they are at the same level. Therefore fertilization may occur very easily here. Next is the in wind pollinated maize. Now in wind pollinated, as we've learned the characteristics of the wind pollinated flower. So what is that? Pollination is brought about wind. कि pollination किसके through होती है? The agent here is wind. As the wind blows, जैसे wind it blows, so what happens, that pollen from the outward hanging anthers is blown easily away because the anthers are loosely attached to the filament. These are all the characteristics which you have learned before. So they are loosely attached and a slight wind or a slight shake can dispose of or burst out the anthers. Now the pollen grains take away the wind, take away the pollen grains, okay, away by the wind, and may fall on the feathery stigma of the female flower. As you learned that the flower should be feathery enough so that it may attract or trap the pollen grains very effectively. Now the male flower matures earlier than the female one, so there are less chances of self-pollination. So in this case, you know, there are less chances of self-pollination because the male flower, you know, it gets earlier matures, means it matures earlier, वो जल्दी mature हो जाता है as compared to the female one. So in this case, self-pollination, there are less chances for self-pollination and therefore it goes for cross-pollination. So this is the maize plant and this is the female inflorescence, which is also known as tassel. Now what happens here, as you've learned that these are outwards, okay, so a slight wind can shake this off and the pollen grains may come out. So the pollen grains, they are carried away by the wind, so which is an agent of cross pollination. So these pollen grains may rest on another plant of the maize having the feathery, which contains the feathery stigma. So what happens, that pollen grains, they come out from here and they lie on the feathery stigma. So this leads to the pollination. So our next heading is fertilization. Fertilization is the union or the fusion of nuclei of the male and female gamete. What? That is, it is the fusion of the male gamete with the female gamete. So this is fertilization. Now in flowering plants, the pollen grains produces two male gametes and the ovule inside the ovary produces the female gamete. We have learned this. Now, the pollen grains, we have also learned the pollen grain structure, but we are going to discuss it in detail today. Now, the pollen grain, the mature pollen grain is a cell with a double wall. So, what is pollen grain? It is a double walled structure. The outer layer is known as the exine and the inner layer is known as intine. The structure of pollen grain is very important from examination point of view. So, it is a double membrane structure, okay, double wall structure, and the outer layer इसकी होती है which is known as exine and the inner layer is known as intine. I stands for inner, I stands for intine. So, you can remember in this way. Its nucleus has already divided into tube nucleus and generative nucleus. So, this requires a very lengthy process which we will study in later. As you grow up, you will study this. Just to remember is that its nucleus has divided into two nucleus which is known as the tube nucleus and generative nucleus. So, these two nuclei you may remember. Now, at this stage, the pollen is transferred to the stigma. So, at this particular stage where two nucleus are formed, this is the stage when the pollen is transferred to the stigma for the pollination. Further chances in pollen grains occur only if it has fallen on the stigma of the plant of the same species. This is what's important, that the pollen grain should fall on the stigma of a plant which is of same species, then only pollination may occur, because there are very other factors which reduce or which block the pollination to occur or fertilization to occur. Now, next is ovule. First of all, going to the ovule, I would like to show the diagram of the pollen grain. So, this is the diagram of the pollen grain. As you can see, this is exine, which is the outer layer, and it is not in a circular way. So, intine, this is the intine, this is the tube nucleus, this is the generative nucleus, and this is the germ pore. So, germ pore is what? From where the pollen tube will come out or it will germinate. So, what happens? It is a very lengthy process and you will study it in more higher classes. So, in a simple language, I will tell you that the generative nucleus and the tube nucleus, when the pollen tube is formed, so these nuclei, they come to the end of the pollen tube. Now, what happens? In this case, the generative nucleus, they form the two sperm gametes or the two sperm nuclei, and the tube nucleus remains as such. So, this is the stage or the three-cell stage. Now, the ovule is the inner part of the ovary, as you learned it. Ovule is destined to become the seed and ovary to become the fruit containing the seed inside. This is very important, that ovule forms seed and ovary forms fruit. So, in this question, many of the students, they get confused कि ovule fruit बनाता है या seed बनाता है. So, there is a trick to remember this, that is ovary. R आ रहा है. So, fruit में R. So, this is the trick which you can use to remember that ovary makes fruit and ovule makes seed. Now, a single ovule produces single seeded fruit. अगर एक single ovule होगा तो it will make a single fruit. Now, many ovules produces many seeded fruit. That's certain. Each ovule has one or two protective coverings called integuments. As we've learned in pollen grains that it has two walls. So, this is what your protection. This is for protection, your protecting coverings. So, in case of ovule also, there are two protective coverings which are known as integuments. Okay. So, this is the term used for the ovule. जहाँ पे integuments are something, protective layers around the ovule. The integuments leave a small opening called the micropyle. This is very important. कि micropyle क्या होता है? At one end for the entry of the pollen tube. As you learned कि pollen tube बनता है germ pore से, जब pollen tube के end में generative और tube nucleus आ जाते हैं. So in this case, जब ovule की बात कर रहे हैं, तो integuments आपस में ज्वाइंट हो जाती है, उसको प्रोटेक्ट तो करके रखती हैं. We'll study the diagram, but I am just telling you in short that integuments आई, उसने ओव्यूल को प्रोटेक्ट करके रखा. अब जो ऊपर से एक ओपनिंग बचाती है, that is called micropyle. There are various structures of ovules which we'll study later, but just remember कि एक ओपनिंग बच जाती है, स्मॉल ओपनिंग, जिसको हम माइक्रोपाइल कहते हैं, एंड दिस इज द साइट जहां से pollen tube एंटर होती है. So this is very important. Now enclosed by the integuments is the nucleus. ठीक है, न्यूक्लियस इज फूड लेटिंग टिश्यू जो उसको फूड देता है या न्यूट्रिशन प्रोवाइड करता है ग्रोइंग एम्ब्रियो को. एंड फर्दर इनसाइड द न्यूक्लियस इन द एम्ब्रियो सैक. अब इंटेगुमेंट्स के अंदर कौन इंक्लूज रहता है? न्यूक्लियस। और न्यूक्लियस के अंदर न्यूक्लियस, दिस इज द न्यूक्लियस. सो न्यूक्लियस के अंदर दैट इज द एम्ब्रियो सैक. सो न्यूक्लियस इज व्हाट? अ फूड लेडन सेल और अ फूड लेडन टिश्यू. सो न्यूक्लियस के अंदर रहेगा एम्ब्रियो सैक. ओके. So the embryo sac contains 7 cells. It is very important. Now 3 plus 3 plus 1. Now 3 cells they are present at the micropylar end, जिसमें से एक egg cell होता है and एक 2 synergids होते हैं. So this process कि ये कैसे बनते हैं, this you learn this in higher classes. So as you are in 9th standard, so you just remember कि micropylar end में 3 cells होते हैं जिसमें से 2 synergids होते हैं and एक 1 जो होता है that is the egg cell. 3 cells at the opposite end. एक माइक्रोपाइलर एंड है और उसके अपोजिट एंड में जो है वो 3 cells होते हैं. दैट इज नोन एज द एंटीपोडल सेल्स. ओके. नाउ वन लार्ज सेंट्रल सेल, एक लार्ज सेंट्रल सेल होता है विच कंटेन्स 2 न्यूक्लियाई फ्यूज टुगेदर. तो सेंट्रल सेल में क्या होते हैं? 2 न्यूक्लियाई होते हैं जो आपस में क्या रहते हैं? फ्यूज रहते हैं. सो गोइंग विद द स्ट्रक्चर ऑफ ओव्यूल. सो फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल मैं आपको ये वाला डायग्राम क्लियर करवाती हूँ. सो दिस इज व्हाट द जर्मिनेशन ऑफ पॉलन एंड फर्टिलाइजेशन. ठीक है, कि पॉलन ट्यूब कैसे जर्मिनेट हुई और कैसे फर्टिलाइजेशन होती है. अब देखिए ये है ओव्यूल. ठीक है. अब स्टिग्मा, स्टाइल एंड ओवरी, एज यू नो द पार्ट्स. नाउ व्हाट हैपेंस कि पॉलन ग्रेन आया, उसने जर्मिनेट होना स्टार्ट किया, पॉलन ट्यूब बनी. अब दिस इज योर माइक्रोपाइलर एंड और ये एंटीपोडल एंड है. एंटीपोडल एंड में क्या होंगे हमारे पास? एंटीपोडल, 3 एंटीपोडल सेल्स हैं. एज यू कैन सी 1, 2 एंड 3. तो 3 एंटीपोडल सेल्स हुए. नाउ इन दिस केस माइक्रोपाइलर एंड में क्या होता है? देर आर 2 synergids, 2 synergids हैं और एक बीच में, एज यू कैन सी दिस इज एन egg cell, दिस इज एन egg cell, और जो 2 साइड में है दिस आर द synergids. सो synergids का फंक्शन क्या होता है? बेसिकली इट इज द फंक्शन ऑफ synergids इसकी वो अट्रैक्ट करते हैं पॉलन ट्यूब्स को, कि पॉलन ट्यूब ने कहाँ से आना है. बिकॉज पॉलन ट्यूब तो एंटर कर जाती है बट द फंक्शन कि ये कहाँ को एंटर करेगी दैट इज डन बाय द synergids. की synergids इसको स्टिमुलेट करती है कि आप यहाँ से आइए, फ्रॉम दिस साइड और फ्रॉम दैट साइड. सो the function of synergid is basically to guide the pollen tube. Now a pollen tube आई, enter हुआ. अब this is the polar nuclei. polar nuclei मतलब कि एक central cell है जिसके पास 2 nuclei हैं. ठीक है. Now so this is the ovary and ये ovule रहा, ये embryo sac रहा, और इसके बाहर जो रहेंगे वो इंटेगुमेंट्स रहेंगे जो उसको प्रोटेक्ट करके रखेंगे. Now ये है एक पर्टिकुलर डायग्राम. देखिए पर्टिकुलर डायग्राम. सी दिस इज योर एंटीपोडल सेल्स. ठीक है, 3 एंटीपोडल सेल्स आगे, ओव्यूल आगे, न्यूक्लियस, दिस इज द न्यूक्लियस जो क्या है? फूड लेडन टिश्यू है जो प्रोवाइड करेगा, न्यूट्रिशन देगा, मतलब विल प्रोवाइड न्यूट्रिशन. अब इसके अंदर क्या हमने पढ़ा था? दैट इज द एम्ब्रियो सैक. अब एम्ब्रियो सैक के अंदर हमारे पास एक माइक्रोपाइलर एंड है और एक एंटीपोडल जहां पे एंटीपोडल सेल्स प्रेजेंट हैं. तो 3 एंटीपोडल सेल्स हैं, माइक्रोपाइलर एंड है जहां पे 2 synergids यहाँ पे डॉटेड शो किए हैं और यू कैन शो इट इन द वे इट इज शोन हियर. सो 2 synergids आ गए एंड 1 egg cell आ गया. नाउ आ गया, दिस इज द सेंट्रल सेल जहां पे क्या है? पोलर न्यूक्लियाई हैं. अब देखिए यू विल स्टडी कि सेकेंडरी फर्टिलाइजेशन होती है. सो दैट विल स्टडी लेटर. फर्स्ट दिस इज द एंटीपोडल सेल्स हो गए, माइक्रोपाइलर egg cell हो गया एंड दिस इज द पोलर न्यूक्लियाई. सो दिस इज योर and this is the pollen tube which is entering, ठीक है, which is carrying the 2 sperm nuclei and the tube nucleus is basically degenerated. So this is the oval diagram. So as I was telling you that germination of the pollen grains occurs in the following way. That is pollen grain germinate only if it falls on the stigma of the same species. This is the one particular or the important point कि pollen grain तभी germinate करेगा उसी स्टिग्मा पे जब वो सेम स्पीशीज के स्टिग्मा पर फॉल करता है, अदरवाइज इट डिसजनरेट्स. ठीक है, वो खत्म हो जाता है. द pollen grain on falling on the stigma is stimulated to germinate due to the secretion of sugars by the stigma. अब सेम स्पीशीज पे फॉल कर गया बट उसको स्टिमुलेशन कौन देगा? जो शुगर प्रेजेंट होगी स्टिग्मा पर, दैट विल स्टिमुलेट द pollen grain कि वो क्या करे? pollen tube की फॉर्मेशन करना स्टार्ट करें. नाउ थ्रू अ पॉइंट इन द एक्साइन इज द pollen tube. हमने पढ़ा था कि एक्साइन से pollen tube emerge होके आती है, विच इज नथिंग बट द एक्सटेंशन ऑफ द एक्साइन ओनली. नाउ दिस इज ठीक है, pollen tube बनी, कैरिंग एट द टिप जनरेटिव न्यूक्लियस एंड ट्यूब न्यूक्लियस. जनरेटिव न्यूक्लियस 2 sperm nuclei बनाती है, एज यू हैव लर्न्ड. जिसे हम मेल गैमेट्स कहते हैं। सो दस इन दिस वे जो पोलन ग्रेन्स है वो क्या करता है, जर्मिनेट करता है हमारे स्टिग्मा के ऊपर। द पोलन ट्यूब ग्रोज थ्रू द स्टिग्मा, वो क्या करता है, हमने पढ़ा था कि वो इट ग्रोज थ्रू द स्टिग्मा and style by dissolving the tissue with the help of enzymes and reaches the ovary, कि वो टिश्यू को डिसॉल्व करता रहता है एंजाइम्स की हेल्प से, and then it what happens कि it reaches the ultimate ovary. Now where it pushes through the micropyle and reaches the embryo sac, जहां पे हमने पढ़ा था कि ये माइक्रोपाइल जो एंड से आता है और वो पुश करता है माइक्रोपाइल एंड से अंदर जाने के लिए, and it particular now it finally reaches the ovary. There it pushes through the micropyle and reaches the embryo sac. Now the tube nucleus which has directed the growth of the pollen tube. अब जो ट्यूब न्यूक्लियस है जिसने क्या किया, ग्रोथ ऑफ पोलन ट्यूब को क्या किया, डायरेक्ट किया कि कहाँ कहाँ से पोलन ट्यूब होगी या कैसे पोलन ट्यूब की ग्रोथ होगी, ऑल द वे डाउन नाउ डिसइंटीग्रेट्स। पोलन ट्यूब न्यूक्लियस का फंक्शन यही है कि पोलन ट्यूब को अंदर तक ले जाना एंड दैट कि इसको डायरेक्शन प्रोवाइड करना, एंड व्हेन इट्स फंक्शन इज ओवर इट डिसजनरेट्स। नाउ द पोलन ट्यूब एंटर्स वन ऑफ द सिनर्जिड्स एंड इट रीचेस टू स्पर्म न्यूक्लियाई। एक सिनर्जिड में एंटर करता है पोलन ट्यूब, किसी एक सिनर्जिड में, एज वी लर्न देयर आर टू सिनर्जिड्स, तो दोनों में से किसी एक सिनर्जिड में पोलन ट्यूब एंटर किया, उसने अपने दो स्पर्म न्यूक्लियाई जो है वो रिलीज कर दिए। ऑफ दीज वन स्पर्म न्यूक्लियस फ्यूजेस विद द एग न्यूक्लियस टू फॉर्म द जाइगोट। दिस इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट, क्योंकि दो स्पर्म न्यूक्लियाई हैं, तो दो स्पर्म न्यूक्लियाई होने से क्या होता है कि एक जो न्यूक्लियस है वो एग सेल के साथ फ्यूज हो जाता है। दिस इज जो एग सेल, तो एक स्पर्म न्यूक्लियस क्या हुआ, एक स्पर्म इसके साथ फ्यूज हो गया, ठीक है, so which leads to the formation of zygote, while the other nucleus or the sperm nucleus moves towards the polar nuclei in the central cell and fuses with them. ठीक है, तो एक स्पर्म तो इसके साथ फ्यूज हो गया एंड जो दूसरा है वो इस पोलर न्यूक्लियाई के साथ फ्यूज हो जाएगा, ठीक है, जो हमारे पास क्या है, सेंट्रल में प्रेजेंट है। So what it will make a 3 nuclei fuse together, क्योंकि दो तो ऑलरेडी प्रेजेंट है एंड एक स्पर्म आ गया तो 3 बन गए, तो what happens कि 3 nuclei fuse हुए, so this is known as the triple fusion. This is very important and this question comes for sure. So this is the triple fusion हो गया, so it leads to the produce embryo that is endosperm nucleus. So triple fusion से endosperm बनता है और जो हमारे पास नॉर्मल फर्टिलाइजेशन होती है दैट इज एग और स्पर्म के बीच में इट लीड्स टू द फॉर्मेशन ऑफ जाइगोट। सो दिस इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट। और देयरफॉर क्योंकि ऑल टुगेदर 2 फर्टिलाइजेशन अकर्स, कि एक साथ क्या हो रही है, दो, एक फर्टिलाइजेशन यहाँ हो रही है, एक यहाँ हो रही है, सो इन दिस केस दिस इज नोन एज द डबल फर्टिलाइजेशन। डबल मीन्स 2 बार फर्टिलाइजेशन हो रही है, सो दिस इज नोन एज द डबल फर्टिलाइजेशन। नाउ the definition of double fertilization, this is very important, that is one sperm fuses with the egg cell nucleus, ठीक है, to form the zygote, और जो other है, other nucleus that is sperm nucleus fuses with the 2 polar nuclei of the central cell to form the endosperm nucleus. Now fate of the floral parts after fertilization. अब देखिए कि फर्टिलाइजेशन होगी, अब फ्लोरल पार्ट्स जो हैं, जो पेटल्स हैं, सेपल्स हैं, स्टिग्मा स्टाइल ओवरी है, उन सबका क्या फेट है। द पेटल्स, स्टेमन, स्टाइल एंड स्टिग्मा विदर एंड दे जनरली फॉल ऑफ, ठीक है, उनका काम खत्म तो वो फॉल ऑफ हो गए। कैलेक्स में आइदर फॉल ऑफ और रिमेन परसिस्टेंट, कि कैलेक्स क्या हो सकता है, हमने पढ़ा है कि या फिर वो फॉल ऑफ हो जाता है या फिर वो परसिस्टेंट रहता है ना, ड्राइड एंड श्रिवल्ड फॉर्म। एप्पल एंड गुआवा clearly show some dried sepals as you can see, and brinjal में green calyx persist रहता है and it remains until कि जब तक fruit mature हो जाता है, till then also and after that also it remains persistent. The ovary enlarges, ovary क्या बनाएगी अब, fruit बनाएगी, and the ovarian wall forms the fruit wall. जो ovarian की जो wall होंगी वो ultimately क्या बनाएंगी, fruit wall. The ovary wall may either form a dry and a hard fruit wall or a fleshy fruit wall, ठीक है, कि वो hard भी बना सकती है and a fleshy also. So ovules become the seeds, कि ovules क्या बनाते हैं, हम seeds बनाते हैं. The fruit contains one or more seeds which may be developed from one or more ovules, as we learned before also कि ovules से seeds बनेंगी, तो जितने ज्यादा ovules उतने ज्यादा seeds होंगे. Now attached to the ovary by means of placenta, ठीक है, placenta के साथ वो attached रहते हैं. When the fruit is ripe, जो fruit क्या हो जाता है, पूरी तरह से ripe हो जाता है, पक जाता है, the seed contained inside are released by one and or other method and grow into new plant in suitable conditions. कि जब fruit पूरी तरह से ripe हो गया, seeds आ गए, तो वो किसी ना किसी मेथड से नए प्लांट में डेवलप हो जाता है। सो दैट इज दिस इज व्हाट कि क्या क्या बनता है। ओवरी से फ्रूट बनती है, ओवरीवॉल से पेरिकार्प बनता है, ठीक है। ओव्यूल से सीड, प्लेसेंटा से स्टॉक ऑफ द सीड बनती है, प्लेसेंटा से जो सीड की जो स्टॉक होती है। आउटर इंटेगुमेंट्स टेस्टा बनाती है, इंटर इंटेगुमेंट्स टेगमेन। दिस इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट कि जो सीड कोट है कि सीड को कौन प्रोटेक्ट करके रखेगा, दैट इज टेस्टा एंड टेगमेन। कि जो आउटर इंटेगुमेंट होती है हमारे ओव्यूल के बाहर, तो वो बनाती है टेस्टा एंड इनर इंटेगुमेंट मेक्स टेगमेन। तो दिस आर द कवरिंग ऑफ द सीड्स। सो रिमेंबर कि सीड की कवरिंग होती है टेस्टा एंड टेगमेन, बट जो ओव्यूल की कवरिंग है या जो उनको प्रोटेक्शन देता है दैट इज द इंटेगुमेंट्स, दैट इज आउटर और इनर इंटेगुमेंट्स। सेकेंडरी न्यूक्लियस, एंडोस्पर्म, सेल, एग सेल और सिनर्जिड्स क्या बनाएंगे, एम्ब्रियो एंड एंटीपोडल सेल जो है वो डिसऑर्गेनाइज्ड रह जाते हैं, ठीक है। तो उनका पर्टिकुलर कोई फंक्शन नहीं रहता। So this was all for your chapter pollination. If you liked my video, do subscribe my channel and don't forget to hit the bell icon